You have to look out for number one. Sometimes you'll see a movie character say, hey, you gotta look out for number one. And they'll use it to justify some really heinous antisocial stuff, right? They're out there hurting people. But looking out for number one doesn't just mean hurting other people. Often the best thing for number one, for a person, is cooperation. Sometimes competition, but rarely is direct conflict generally advantageous because conflict is destructive. Competition doesn't have to be destructive by comparison. Looking out for number one is ultimately the correct and sane choice for yourself, for your family, for your community, for your nation, for your country. Now, here's the deal. If you don't put yourself first, who will? More than that, who could, even if they wanted to? No one can go exercise for you. No one can eat right for you. No one can resist temptation for you. They can't resist junk food or alcohol for you or resist abusing prescription pain medication. And I think we can all understand this. We get it on a personal level that really it is you. No one can really be what you are for you. But this also applies to your family. Your kids have to come first before someone else's kids. Not because you hate other kids, not because you don't necessarily want to help, but you're in a position to help and guide your children. You're not really in a position to guide other people's children. So on a level of family, your family is number one, and you got to look out for them. But let's also bring it to the state level. In the United States, a congressman in the federal Congress needs to earmark money and fight for some of the tax dollars that left their state to come back home. If you lived in Montana and all of the congressmen and senators from Montana stopped fighting for any money to go back to Montana, then it wouldn't. It wouldn't go back to Montana anymore. You don't think New York wants some of that? California's eager for more money. The congressmen from Texas and Florida might be okay with Montana getting their fair share, but they're not going to take their time to make sure Montana gets a reasonable cut of the pie. The same thing at a country level. If the French government wanted to help the poor, where would they be best doing it? Certainly not in Chile. French officials likely don't know very much about the challenges that face the poor in Chile or how to best help poor Chileans. They're going to be better off helping poor Parisians or poor people anywhere else in France. Now, if they did decide to go crazy, if they started helping the Chileans instead of the French, who will help the poor French? Well, no one. No one's going to do that. It wouldn't make any sense. South Korea isn't going to see that poor French people aren't being helped and start an outreach program for poor Parisians. They're going to look out for number one. France is not number one in South Korea. South Korea is number one in South Korea. To expect anything different would be unreasonable. You have to look out for number one. Number one has to come first. If you're not concerned with number one, you're doing it wrong. Who will China have as number one? Themselves. Don't expect the world's largest country with over 1.5 billion people to start putting anyone but themselves first. And how about way down to the smallest countries in the Pacific with less than 100,000 people? Who's number one for them? Themselves. From the biggest to the smallest, you got to look out for number one, and that applies to every country. You'll often see this sentiment expressed in the mainstream right wing, where your average Republican will ask a question like, why are we spending money overseas to help other people while there's still homeless veterans around? Or they'll say something like, as long as there's one homeless veteran, we shouldn't be sending our money overseas like this. And that makes sense. Certainly we could allocate that money at home before we bother scouring the world to spend our money on other people's problems. And this very basic piece of common sense is ignored. Foreign aid is somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 billion a year. That could be $1 billion more dollars given to each state. Or $50 billion less dollars collected in taxes. Or $50 billion put towards the national debt. Keep in mind the national debt is over $23 trillion and rising fast. But here's the thing. People look out for themselves first. People put their family first. People put their community first. People put their race first. Now, if you tell someone that, their reaction is pretty predictable. The majority of black people consider race to be super important. If you tell a black person that people put their race first, he'll say, yeah, and what about it? In fact, it's not just black people who you could talk to about this. It's everyone. Everyone puts their race first. Check out this Pew poll. The majority of every group considers their race very important. Now, when you tell a white person that, hey, people put their race first, they might contort their face or roll their eyes. Oh, come on, people don't do that anymore. And it's predictable. Whites are the only group who stopped putting their race first. China is at no risk of being controlled by anyone except the Chinese in the future. Nigeria is, for the long haul, likely going to stay very black, a Nigerian place to be. Iranians would not stand for their country becoming non-Iranian in any way, legal or illegal immigration. Meanwhile, Stockholm isn't safe. London isn't safe. Detroit was destroyed decades ago. White countries are becoming less and less white, less and less friendly to us, and it doesn't matter whether it's happening legally or illegally. The result is the same. When Trump gets up and talks about black unemployment numbers, now why does he do that? We all know why he does that. He needs to tell black people what he's going to do for them. That's how politics works, right? If you want Asians to vote for you, tell the Asians what you're going to do for them. Want Hispanics to vote for you? Well, then hurry up and tell them how you support them and how you're going to enact policies that help them. If you don't have specific things to offer them, then they're not really interested. But then what happens when someone stands up and says, what about us? What about us whites? What will be done for the white people? Now, you've broken a taboo. A taboo is something that's forbidden. It's taboo for white people to do what everyone else does. Now, this taboo is mostly pushed from the top down, as far as I can tell, from the media onto the people. When Andrew Yang early in his campaign talked about helping white people, grassroots whites didn't take to the street to protest him for breaking a taboo. No, it was a media effort that attacked him after that. Red Ice recently got removed from Facebook after a hit piece was published. Not some sort of grassroots petition from Facebook users. No, a hit piece in the media. But even if the taboo is pushed heavily in the media, the average white person is buying it, or at least complying with it in silence, afraid of what might happen to them if they complain too loudly about this particular taboo. So the reality is exposed and in front of our faces. Every race in a country is at a tug of war for resources. They want government money, programs that help them. And white people won't pull on their end of the rope. The rope is rapidly slipping through their hands, and they won't even close tight around it and defend the rope they already have. Instead of pulling to gain, we could just pull hard enough to maintain, but we aren't even doing that. In a couple hundred years, Nigerian children will continue to dance their traditional dances, sing their songs, and play like Nigerian children do today. But white Swedish children, white Canadian children, white German children, now they might be a different story. Not only might those children not have very much rope left, but they won't have the strength to defend the rope from people who are willing to pull against them. Looking out for number one isn't just a description of what people do, although it's a pretty good description of what people do most of the time. Looking out for number one is advice. The mother running herself ragged for her children because she hasn't said no often enough is failing to look out for number one. Her husband often has to step in, help her by reminding her to look out for number one and maybe canceling a couple obligations that she's set up, a few too many. She'll be a better mother if she sleeps well, if she takes care of herself sufficiently. You may have to sacrifice some of your desires and distractions for your children, but you shouldn't be sacrificing much in the way of basic needs. And we've done the same thing in the modern day at a societal level. The Dalai Lama said we can and should help refugees and migrants, help them, educate them, and then send them back so they can build up their countries. But we're not sending them back. They're living here now. They're voting here now. Eventually, all of your elected officials will look like Ilhan Omar. None of the elected officials in England will be Englishmen eventually. None of the Scottish officials will be Scots. No Norwegians will have a Norwegian representative. Instead, they'll have a Muslim representative, a Black African representative, an Asian representative. And those representatives do know how to look out for number one. How do you think they got control of that country? The Muslim representative will look out for number one. The Black representative will look out for number one. The Asian representative will look out for number one. It's kind of ironic that all these whites who want to live in a post-racial world are managing to fill their countries with people who will refuse to be post-racial and who will look out for number one. A Hispanic Senate won't close the border. A Hispanic Congress will not remove illegal aliens. So here we are. We're in a feminized society, sacrificing ourselves for our surrogate children. Here's a gentle reminder. You got to look out for number one. Remember that the next time a fellow white, particularly a racially conscious white, needs a job or a place to stay, or anything you can work with them on. If you can sell an old used car for $1,500 to one of our brothers, but you think you might be able to get $1,750 for it if you sell it to someone who hates us, well, I'm just saying the rope is slipping, and they do look out for number one.